There was once a great white bull on the island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea, and it was, apparently, very handsome. Now, King Minos of Crete was fucking around, honestly, because he had promised to sacrifice that bull to his god Poseidon. But he liked it so much, remember it was very handsome, that he decided to keep it for breeding his other cattle, and he sacrificed another much shittier bull instead. And one of the reasons I love the Greek gods is they came up with all of these strange and hilarious punishments for mortals who insulted them. And Minos' punishment was to be creatively cruel, because they didn't go after him directly, but sort of punished him by proxy by going after his wife, Pasiphae. The gods of the sea cursed her with love, which is a fun sentence to say, by the way, for the very animal that her husband had so rudely refused to sacrifice, and she grew so attracted to it that she started thinking of ways of getting funky. And so the bull that Minos had kept for breeding purposes ended up breeding with his own wife. I guess that's an example of comedic irony. Pasiphae eventually had a son, Asterion. And Asterion was not an easy kid to raise because he was born with the head of a bull and the tail of a bull, which wasn't his fault, by the way, and he shouldn't have been loved any less for his deformity. But he was very aggressive and very strong, and he only ate human flesh. Small but significant detail. And so instead of building him an awesome bedroom in his palace at Knossos, with a red race car bed and Spider-Man bed sheets, Minos built a different kind of bedroom for Asterion. He went and found the master architect and the genius builder, Daedalus, who you will know, by the way, as the father of Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun on wax wings. And he had Daedalus build the great labyrinth at Knossos, a place of winding corridors so confusing that once you entered, you would never find your way back out. And Asterion, who now went by his popular nickname Minotaurus, the Minotaur, was led inside. Crete ended up going to war with Athens, and the Cretians won an easy victory. This gave Minos an idea, a sort of two birds with one very cruel stone kind of scenario. He could punish the Athenians and keep his bastard son well fed at the same time by forcing the Athenians to pay tribute to Crete in the shape of human sacrifices. So every year the Athenians would have to send 7 young men and 7 young women, preferably virgins. I don't know why these old stories are so focused on virgins a lot of the time. I don't think the Minotaur would have cared if the humans he ate were virgins or not, unless, of course, he really loved the taste of pristine hymen. But anyway, these 14 youngsters were to be sent on a ship to Crete, where they would be led into the labyrinth and eaten by the Minotaur. And the day these young people sailed was a great day of mourning in Athens, as it would be. Just imagine, you're sending these young people away, not because they're going away to college, not because they're going backpacking across South America to take trendy Instagram photos at Machu Picchu. They're being sent to the land of your military subjugators to be fed alive to a bull monster. And so these young people would sail on a ship with black sails to represent the mourning of the Athenian people. And the Athenian tribute to Crete was given a couple of times, but eventually Theseus showed up in Athens. Theseus is one of the OG superheroes of the ancient myths, a sort of protege and good friend of Hercules's, and if we are to judge others by the company they keep, Hercules is pretty much the most awesome friend you could possibly have. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of what kind of a guy Theseus is, He's actually the Duke of Athens and the heir to the throne, but he didn't know that he grew up estranged in a different land. But his father, King Aegeus, had left him a hint. He hid his own sandals and his own sword underneath this big boulder. And he said, once my son is strong enough that he can move this boulder by himself, he will find my sandals and my sword, and he will know his destiny. He will come to Athens and reunite with me. And Theseus grows very strong very quickly, and he moves the boulder, and he finds the sandals and the sword, and somebody offers to just give him a ride to Athens. But Theseus says no. It would be a disgrace to arrive in Athens without mud on these sandals and blood on this sword, and then he starts walking. Theseus doesn't like the fact that his people are being sacrificed to a Cretan monster one bit, and so he demands to be sent as one of the tributes on the next ship so that he can enter the labyrinth and kill the Minotaur. If you're into comic books, by the way, check out Kill the Minotaur by Image Comics. I really like horror comics. I don't really read comics about superheroes, but I thought that was really cool. I read it last year, and it's a spin on the exact story that I'm telling you right now. But anyway, Theseus and the other tributes are preparing to set sail for Crete, and King Aegeus comes to them with a bunch of white sails. Remember, they would set off with black sails to represent their sadness. But he says, when you're on your way back, could you please use these white sails instead, so that when I'm looking to the horizon I can see you, and I can know that you're alive, and I can know that you are returning with hope for the Athenian people. So they take the white sails and they set off. And I've often thought about what the mood must have been like on the boat that evening. Remember, these are young people, many of them probably leaving home for the first time, and they're probably going to a horrible death in a foreign land. Do they sleep at all? Do they drink? Do they party? Do they hug? Do they cry? Do they tell stories? Do they lose their virginities to one another? They eventually arrive in Crete, and as they disembark, Theseus is spotted by Ariadne. Ariadne is one of the daughters of King Minos and a princess of Crete, and she falls instantly in love with Theseus. It's love at first sight, another thing that I think only really happens in these stories. I don't think I've ever had love at first sight. I mean, have you? There was this one time where I guess I kind of had love at second sight. When I was a young schoolboy, my only good subjects really were Swedish and English, but there was this one girl in my English class who I really hated. She was at least as good as me at English, but the difference was that Swedish and English were my first and second language respectively, but they were her third and fourth. She was a first-generation immigrant, and she had that immigrant mentality where she wasn't going to take any shit from anybody. She would hate for me to say that about her, but I think it was probably true. And she made me feel bad about myself, and she would correct my grammar. And then many years later, when I was at university, I meet this girl in a bar. And I think I fell pretty much instantly in love with her before we even spoke. But that was before I realized that it was that same girl who I used to hate so much when we took English together. And we started talking, and she realized who I was, and she asked me, so did your English get any better? And I was so annoyed that I could have strangled her right there. But we ended up dating for over 3 years, and we traveled to many beautiful places in the world together. Thank you for everything, Sarah. I still think about you with your big black electric guitar and that pink beret that you used to wear in the winter. Was that a gift from my mother? Well, anyway, back to Theseus. So Ariadne falls desperately in love with this hero, and she realizes that he's probably going to die inside the labyrinth and be eaten by her half-brother Asterion, and she doesn't want that. She wants to help. And so she goes and finds Daedalus, the man who designed the labyrinth in the first place, and he says it's kind of simple to make your way back out of the labyrinth. All you have to do is perfectly retrace your steps because there's only one way in and one way out. And he gives her a piece of string, a very long piece of string, presumably. And so at night, Ariadne sneaks away, goes to Theseus, and gives him the string and tells him, tie one end of this to the entrance of the labyrinth and take the other end with you, and once you've finished with the Minotaur, you can follow the string back out. And so Theseus thanks her, and the next day, he enters the labyrinth. Now the climax of this story is over quite quickly. He runs into the Minotaur almost instantly, and the fight is over right away. It's not even a good fight. It's kind of like McGregor versus Aldo, because Theseus decapitates the Minotaur with his second strike of his sword. And then he uses the string that he got from Ariadne, and he becomes the first person to make his way back out of the labyrinth with all the other 13 tributes. And so they take Ariadne and her sister, and they run away to the docks. And they get on a boat, and they leave Crete victorious. Now, if they weren't partying on their way to Crete, then I assume that they were definitely partying on the way back. Just imagine you've survived this amazing ordeal. You've made new friends, maybe even fallen in love. You're on your way home, and you're in the presence of Theseus, who is your friend, and at this point, one of the greatest heroes in Greek history. The feeling must have been pretty cool, but they make the very unfortunate decision of stopping on a small island on their way back to Athens. And this island just happens to belong to one of the gods, Dionysus. You might know him as Bacchus. He's sort of the god of getting fucked up. He's the god of drinking. He's the god of orgies. And Dionysus likes Ariadne, and he demands that she stay on the island with him. And Theseus, unlike Minos, knows that when the gods make demands, you're not really in a position to bargain. So he has to leave this great love of his life, who has saved him and who he just met on the island, to swap spit with a literal party god and go back to Athens alone, or with the other tributes, and Ariadne's sister, who I think he ends up marrying in the end. But he's so sad about losing his girlfriend that he forgets to use the white sails like he had promised his father Aegeus, and so they sail towards Athens with the black sails. And Aegeus, he's standing on a cliff and he's waiting for them to come back, but when he sees the black sails on the horizon, he assumes that that means that his son is dead and that their mission was a failure, and he's so desperately sad that he throws himself off the cliff into the sea, committing suicide. And here in our real world, that sea where that happened actually bears his name to this day, the Aegean Sea. It's where a lot of scholars used to believe that the sunken city of Atlantis might be. So Theseus returns to Crete triumphant and a hero and a king. He's going to assume the throne now that his father is dead. But he's lost his father and he's lost the love of his life, so it's ultimately a pretty sad tale. I guess the reason I've been thinking a lot about that story lately, the reason I really like it, is that it is so focused on the return journey, on the way home. And I think that's really interesting. The actual climax of the story, Theseus fighting the Minotaur, that would be the dragged out, 30-minute action sequence in the Hollywood adaptation of this story. But it's not the point of the story. The point is, how do you make your way back home, and what have you learned along the way? And the Greeks were really good at that. I mean, Orpheus trying to rescue Eurydice from the underworld, and I guess pretty much the greatest story ever told in human history is a Greek tale of a journey home. Odysseus went to war in Troy, but then he had to hurry back because he was worried that somebody was going to try and fuck his wife. And he was right, by the way. A lot of people were trying to fuck his wife, and he had to pull off some pretty impressive archery to win her back. But Theseus stepped into the labyrinth, and he was more than strong enough to achieve what he was trying to achieve. But the only reason he made it back out is because somebody helped him. Somebody who loved him. And that is something that I'm trying to work on in my life, something that I've noticed is that when I feel lost, if I'm sad or upset about something, what I tend to do is I isolate myself. I build barriers between myself and the rest of the world. And it's very hard in those times to force yourself to go outside and to be a person with other people. But if you do that, if you do go to dinner with a friend or you call your mother, it turns out, at least I feel a lot better by the end, even if I didn't talk about the things that were upsetting me in the first place. And I thought about how some people probably have days like that, but they don't necessarily have people in their life who they can rely on to make them feel better. I'm so very fortunate to have all of these amazing people in my life, and I really should be more grateful about that. But I just wanted to say that if you are in a little bit of a lonely situation, and to whatever small extent, whatever platonic extent I am capable, I do love you and I do care about you, and I really do hope that things turn around for you. But life can be a little bit like a labyrinth. Sometimes I feel like we wake up in the morning and we exit our homes and step into a large labyrinth where we don't know if we're going to make it back to a place where we feel safe and where we know ourselves again. My parents called me yesterday and told me that they have sold their house and that they're moving. And that kind of knocked me off center, because that house is where I grew up. I lived there from the ages of like 1.5 to 20 or 21 when I left Sweden for the first time and moved abroad. And now when I go back to see my family, when I return to my point of origin, I'm going to have to go to a strange house where I've never been, and I'm going to have to use the guest room. And like my parents said, your home is not the house that we live in. Your home is your family, and you're coming to see us. And that's obviously true, but it's also different, if you know what I mean. A house and a place, and the feeling of a place like that, the fact that you know exactly which steps on the staircase are going to creak when you step on them. Things like that, they're very different from seeing people, seeing the family that you care about, even though, of course, the family is more precious than a house. But now that my point of origin in the world has shifted, what I thought about when I was telling the story of the labyrinth to you guys is that if I had a time machine and I could go back and have a conversation with the master builder, Daedalus, the advice that I would give him, the sort of prophetic advice that I would bring as a person from the future would be that if you want to build a truly confusing labyrinth, one from which the hero does not emerge triumphant at the end, you have to build it in a way where the entrance is not in one fixed place, but where the entrance actually moves, because then it doesn't matter if somebody on the outside is helping you. It doesn't matter if you are able to retrace your steps. Your only way out is to try and forge a new path ahead, and that is a lot harder. Obviously, the hypothetical perfect version of the labyrinth would be the one where you step outside, and even though you see blue skies above and you can smell the ocean on the breeze, you know, because you've been made to realize that all you've done is step into a larger and more confusing part of the labyrinth called life. And much like those first few Athenian tributes, the only thing you can be truly sure of is that the monster of death waits hungrily at the end. Let's do an advertisement. The second ever Framewhisperers podcast is brought to you by Ghosts. We're real, and we really don't appreciate it when you keep saying you don't believe in us. In fact, there are 3 of us listening to the podcast with you in the room right now. Don't bother looking around, we're invisible, you dork. Turn the volume up and stop touching your genitals. It's disgusting, frankly. Go to ectoplaza.com and enter promo code FRAME at checkout for a free jar of ectoplasm with every purchase. What kind of shoes does a frog wear in the summer? Open-toed sandals. That is easily one of the worst jokes ever written by a human being, but it's part of this tradition in the UK where I used to live called Christmas crackers. I don't know if you have Christmas crackers in the US. I don't know if it's something that you do. I'm not talking, by the way, about white people who drink too much on Christmas Day and fall in a ditch. It's this little packet made out of festive paper that you pull apart, two people, and one ends up with a strip of paper in their hand that has a joke written on it. And the joke is always absolutely terrible. But something interesting that I learned about Christmas crackers recently that I wanted to bring up, because I think it's really interesting, is the fact that those jokes are apparently written deliberately to be as bad as possible for a very good reason. And it's this: if you're at a dinner party and somebody tells a joke that is only sort of funny, you've instantly fractured the room because you've created factions. The people who liked the joke and who laughed at it, and the people who didn't. And that's not good for the mood when you're hanging out with other people. But if you write a joke that is so bad that it's going to be everybody in the room against the joke, that actually creates a little bit of a common enemy, and it's conducive to a good mood when you're with a group of people. And I thought that was so interesting. The point I'm trying to make by bringing this up is that I don't really like comedies. I don't tend to watch comedies almost at all. I do like comedy in the sense of like stand-up comedy. Some of my favorite stand-up comedians are like Dylan Moran and Joey Diaz. I think it would be pretty cool if people like that wrote the jokes in Christmas crackers. Actually, if it was one of them, it would probably just say, "I don't know, please leave me alone, bitch." But the point I'm making is I don't go to the theater and watch comedy films because I tend not to laugh at them. And when you're watching a comedy and it's not funny, it's a really miserable experience. And if everybody else is laughing but you are not, it creates this really uncomfortable sense of dissonance. But I said that I was going to recommend a film in each of these podcasts, and I decided that I wanted to do a comedy in this one. So I tried to remember what films really made me laugh the last few years. And I remembered this one film that I really loved, and I rewatched it with a friend before making this podcast. I really want to recommend it to you guys because I think it was underappreciated when it came out, and it is really hilarious. It's called The Nice Guys. It stars Russell Crowe and Ryan Gosling. It's kind of like a period film. It's set in the 70s, and it's very, very silly. It has that sort of dark brand of comedy that I really enjoy, but it's got great performances. One thing that I realized, I said in the last episode that Richard Jenkins might be my favorite comedic actor, but after watching this and watching The Big Short, I think it might actually be Ryan Gosling, which is weird because he's known for doing these really sort of deep dramatic roles in movies like Drive and, The Place Beyond the Pines, and that what's that weird film where he has magic hands that can make people come, but he's kind of in a weird relationship with his mother? I forget, but he's absolutely hilarious in this. His comedic timing is perfect. His face is so funny. And the movie has a little bit of a heart. It has a decent story. It has child actors, which is another thing that I dread in film. But everybody in this film is really good. My favorite character in the whole film is actually a kid who just shows up on a bicycle in front of a burnt down house. If you watch the film and Bike Kid shows up, just know that that is my favorite part of the film, and then you'll get a sense of what kind of stuff I like in movies. But definitely check out The Nice Guys. It's kind of difficult to put in a category, like my friend who I watched it with said, because it's kind of a comedy. It's kind of a buddy cop film. It's kind of like a mystery thriller. And the only thing that I can really compare it to is this other slightly older film called Kiss Kiss Bang Bang with Val Kilmer and Robert Downey Jr. It's very similar in a lot of ways, but The Nice Guys is by far the more entertaining film in my opinion. So if you liked Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, definitely check out The Nice Guys. Okay, let's do some questions. I've been looking at all the comments on the first episode ever of this podcast. And first of all, thank you so very much for the beautiful response that I had on that episode. Like I say in it, I was pretty sure that first of all, nobody was going to watch it. And second of all, that nobody who watched it was going to like it. But I wanted to take a chance because I thought it might be fun. And after I uploaded it, I actually had this weird sort of cathartic feeling of joy. I think it's the reason a lot of people keep, a diary. It's really good to get a lot of your thoughts out into some sort of other medium. But I had all these beautiful comments. You guys seem to really enjoy the sound and the quality of my new microphone, which made me happy. But in general, it was just so very kind and so very warm. And so thank you so much for that. I was genuinely emotional when I read your comments. But let's get to a couple of the questions. One that I got that I thought was good was, what's your favorite cereal? I did talk briefly about cereal in that episode, and it's an interesting and important question, so let's deep dive into it. First of all, I grew up on the west coast of Sweden, which meant that I had to eat Swedish cereal. But the interesting thing about growing up in Europe, and I think this depends on what country you're in, like if you grow up in Germany or France, you mainly consume, I think, German and French entertainment. And when you watch things from other countries, they tend to be dubbed or changed, into your own language. But in Scandinavia, because we have small populations, we don't have massive entertainment industries. And so about half the stuff you watch tends to be just subtitled, from America. And I think that's one of the reasons Scandinavian people tend to be pretty good at English. But I was eating all this Swedish cereal, but I had this mythology, all these products that I knew about from America. I knew all about Fruit Loops. I knew all about Captain Crunch, even though I'd never seen them in the real world and I'd never eaten them. What we did have is we had the Kellogg's products. We had Frosties was one of my favorites. That's the really sugary cornflake ones with the tiger. The kids are hanging out and the tiger shows up and goes, "Eat sugar, you fucks," and then they all go skateboarding or whatever. And I think when you're that young, anything that has enough sugar will get you really excited. But I eventually got to go to America for the first time. I think the first time I went, I was 11. I actually have some extended family in the States. Some of my family on my mother's side are circus artists, and they went to America to perform back in the day, and they ended up staying, and now I have cousins over there and everything. So I went when I was 11, and I went to a lot of different places in America. I went to Florida, I went to New York, which was amazing, blew my mind. I went to Vegas, and I went to St. Louis for some reason. But I remember having breakfast at the hotel in, I think it was Fort Lauderdale in Florida, and the breakfast buffet was so different from what you would see in Europe. And it was so exciting for me, like a Swedish kid, because you had all these products, these cereals, these sodas that I'd only ever heard about, and like all my favorite characters and all my favorite films would have every day. And it was almost like stepping through the wardrobe into Narnia a little bit. Obviously, the taste of everything was a little bit disappointing because it just tasted kind of like sugar, but I didn't care. It was blowing my mind, the colors and everything else. And the strangest thing happened. I was having breakfast by the pool at the hotel, and the kid next to me, who was an American kid, was having breakfast, and he had milk in his bowl, and he just put donuts in the bowl with the milk, and he was eating sort of soggy, milky donuts with a spoon. It was one of the strangest things I'd ever seen, and I couldn't tell if this kid was a psychopath or if that was something you actually did in America. But then I remembered I saw one of those sequels to Casper the Ghost, that movie. I think it's Casper 2. The kid, the main character in that film, actually puts donuts in his cereal bowl in the beginning and hands that for breakfast. So I guess it is something you do in America, and I thought that was so weird. And then something else really strange that happened right then is a giant pelican swooped down from above. It was a larger bird than probably I'd ever seen in my life, and it just started eating this trash on the floor. There was a sandwich, and it just drank the sandwich. You know how those birds just gulp things down their throat. And it was this dramatic experience for me that left an impression. And I ended up having, Jolt Cola and Dr. Pepper for the first time, and it was really, really exotic to me. Another really cool thing that happened is I actually got to spend Halloween in America. I spent Halloween in Vegas at my uncle's house, and we had Halloween sort of in Sweden. You would trick or treat, but maybe half the houses you went to, because it's not an old Swedish tradition, would go sorry, what's this about? And you would say, we dress up and you kind of give us candy and it's an American thing. And they would go, oh, okay. And they would go into the kitchen and they would find something to give you, you know? And then some families were doing Halloween parties and knew exactly what it was about. And they were happy when you came over trick or treating. But trick or treating in like a suburban neighborhood in Vegas as an 11-year-old was like life-changingly awesome, because it was again like being in a different world. People had ornaments and stuff all over their houses. They were playing music on massive speakers. This one house, the lady led us into like a little forest area behind her house and down a winding path, and she had people in the bushes scaring us, and the candy was in this massive treasure chest at the end, and it was like a never-ending theme park. And after just a couple of hours, I had like giant bags of candy, more than I could ever eat. And then we went back to my uncle's house and we watched American Werewolf in London, which is a great movie that I still love. So amazing experience. But I think my favorite cereal of all time is just probably maple honey oat granola. Really sugary, none of the raisins, none of the fruit. I want that stuff away from me. I don't like raisins or fruit or strawberries in my cereal, but I love granola, and I love that sweet taste when you get the maple in there. I'll allow cinnamon, I'll allow bananas, but that's probably my favorite thing to have. These days, of course, I live in Japan, and breakfast is weird here. And that's a contemptful thing to say, to call something that is culturally different to you weird. But the Japanese tend to eat pretty much the same thing for breakfast as they do for lunch and dinner. So they'll wake up and have, fish, white rice, and pickles. And that can be really difficult as a Westerner, because we're used to breakfast being so light. We don't really have cooked food in the morning unless it's like bacon. I was reading about bacon the other day, by the way. There's some really interesting and dark history about the way bacon was marketed in the past. Maybe we'll talk about that in another episode. But yeah, it's a little bit difficult, and so I tend not to have breakfast anymore. I just wake up and have black coffee, and then I wait for lunch. But the last thing I wanted to say about cereal and Japan is they actually use it to scam people in this country. You know how you go to fast food places, and if you get like fries or you get a drink, they will sort of try and trick you into thinking that you're getting more product than you are with the packaging. Maybe it has, a hollow bottom or something, and so it looks like you're getting a bigger thing of stuff than you actually are. And they use cornflakes to do something similar in Japan, especially when you get ice cream. So if you go and get like a cone or a cup of ice cream in Japan, it'll look like there's a lot of it in there, but when you get through the ice cream, the whole bottom is just filled up with cornflakes. And I guess that's because they're very light and very cheap, and they're filled with air, so it's an easy thing to use for tricking people. And I used to be so cynical about that. I was dating this Japanese girl who was a very, very bright person, and when we had ice cream, I would always be like, oh look, they're trying to trick us with this bullshit, with these bullshit cornflakes. But she was always saying how, but aren't you happy? Aren't they delicious? You mix them into the vanilla ice cream and it actually works really well. She'd never once thought about it as something that was, devious. And that relationship ended, but the other day I was having ice cream. I just bought a cone of ice cream at the convenience store, and when I got to the bottom, I was expecting there to be cornflakes in there, but there weren't. I had bought a kind of ice cream that didn't have the cornflakes, and I actually felt disappointed. I would have preferred if they were there, and it sort of made me think about that girl and the dynamic of our relationship. She was a much brighter person than I am, and it was just a matter of perspective. You can think that the cornflakes are there to trick you, or you can be happy about the fact that they're actually delicious. Another question that I got a lot on that last episode was, are you okay, or are you doing well, or some version of that? And that is, first of all, very kind of you to ask. I think the reason I got that question is probably because when I listened back to it, it sounded kind of sad in a lot of parts, and I just wanted you to know that that is not because I am sad. I'm actually doing really well, and I'm having a very good time, so please don't worry about me. I think the reason it sounded a little bit like that is because I was trying to be as open and frank as possible. If something popped into my mind, I just wanted to talk about it without putting any filters between me and you. I wanted to be as open and naked as possible, which is why I wasn't wearing clothes while I was recording. That's a joke. But I think I'm getting a little bit allergic to fakeness, and I see a lot of it on platforms like YouTube lately, and so I would rather have this be a little bit strange and maybe a little bit sad sounding than me actually trying to produce it or turn it into something that it isn't. And if I get a couple of comments that say that, it sounds weird or fucked up, maybe that's worth me being able to be a little bit more authentic. And I hope that makes sense. And I hope it's enjoyable to those of you who choose to listen. But thank you so much for asking. I'm doing really well, and I hope you are as well. And if you're not, then I hope things turn around and you do a lot better soon. I have seen the dark universe yawning, where the black planets roll without aim, where they roll in their horror unheeded, without knowledge or luster or name. If somebody asked you, would you like to go to space, would you go? That's probably the wrong way to ask that question, because it would depend on who was asking you, for what reason, and what kind of spaceship they had. If it was NASA who wanted to strap you to one of their controlled explosions to send you to Mars or the moon, you might go, is that safe? This is an actual debate that I had with my ex-girlfriend, the one I mentioned earlier, Serial Girl. She definitely wanted to go, and she talked about it a lot. For me, the answer is super simple. I would never want to leave this planet for any reason whatsoever. It's way too scary and way too strange. I try to explain to her what happens to you in the vacuum of space. I said, have you ever shaken a can of soda and then opened it and looked at the liquid sort of fizzing out and thought, I wish that would happen to all of the fluids inside my body? But I guess, again, it's a matter of perspective, because she's probably not going to get to go to space, and neither will I. And it is fun to think about adventures you could have in some other galaxy. That's the great thing about science fiction. You sort of get to decide your own rules. Technology sufficiently sophisticated is indistinguishable from magic, and so if you have a point you are trying to make with your story, you can create a world where that is very easy to tell. My favorite science fiction story of all time is called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and that is just the best title for any work of fiction that I've ever heard. The first time I read the title, I got goosebumps, since I was obviously going to read the story. It's a very bleak and very pessimistic story, and I apparently have a tendency to be a little bit downbeat in this podcast, so we won't go into it, but I definitely recommend you check it out. I guess the theme of this episode is return journeys and finding the way back home, and I was reading about that and about space recently because I wanted to know about those Sputnik missions that the Soviets did during the space race. They would send these rockets into space never to return, and some of them had live animals on them. The famous hero dog Laika was sent into space, but she never got to return to Earth. They sent her up to die out there, and I just thought that was such a cruel and unkind thing to do to a dog. And obviously you can make the argument that mankind benefited as a result. I'm not sure that I believe that that's a good enough excuse, but what I wanted to know because of that is, what were the first animals that went to space and actually got to return to Earth, that actually came back? And it turns out, as it often does when you look deep enough into something, that it's funny. The Soviet mission Zond 5 was launched in 1968, and it was carrying 2 Russian tortoises. These are really cute tortoises that you can buy in pet shops. If you have a tortoise that you got in a pet shop, it's probably of this species. And the reason they decided to use tortoises is that they are very easy to strap to things. You could basically wrap some duct tape around the shell of a tortoise and stick it to a wall, and it would be pretty content to hang around there for quite a while. Not only did these 2 tortoises go to space, they actually orbited the moon before they crash landed back down into the Indian Ocean, where they were recovered and were absolutely fine. They were a little bit emaciated, apparently, because they hadn't given them any food while they were in space, but they had gone to the moon and back, and they were doing absolutely fine. And I just thought that was really cool. It didn't say what the names of the tortoises were. I hope they had names. I would like to know them, but I wasn't able to find that out. I just wanted to end this episode by mentioning a really cool idea that I heard in a science fiction story that I read last year, and I've forgotten who wrote it, and I've forgotten the name of the story, which is really frustrating. So if you know it, please tell me, because I would love to read it again. But it had this really cool concept where in the story, the world is ending in some sort of cataclysm. Maybe it's caused by humans, who knows? But they've found another planet out somewhere in the universe where humans could presumably live, and so they're going to send a mission with a single man who's going to go alone to that new planet. I can't remember if maybe he was carrying human embryos or something, and he was going to try and restart human civilization in this new place. But it's very, very far away, and he's going to have to go alone. He has technology to keep himself alive, but it's basically going to take him several centuries to go to this new place, and he's going to be alone in space for a very long time. But when he actually gets to this new planet and gets out of his spaceship, what he finds is a sprawling human civilization already existing there. And what had happened in the story is, after he left, the humans who were left on Earth had discovered faster than light speed travel, and so they had basically gone to this planet far ahead of him, and they'd been there for centuries by the time he got there. So there were already generations of people who had been born and died on this new planet, and they greeted him like a hero when he arrived. But I was thinking about, kind of like I was thinking about how those young Athenians must have felt on the ship heading for Crete. What was he thinking when he was alone in his spaceship on his way to this new place? Did he feel heroic? Was he sad about the fact that he thought that human civilization must have ended on Earth and that everybody was dead? And how would he have felt if he knew that he was actually going to see humans on this new planet? Would he feel like the mission was pointless? Would he feel that it was a waste of his time? Would he have been desperate? Or would he have felt a kind of comfort knowing that he was actually going to see friends and people like him when he eventually reached his destination hundreds and hundreds of years from now? And I just thought that was a very interesting and novel idea for a science fiction story. If you know the name, then please let me know, because I would love to read it again. But that is going to wrap up the second episode of my little podcast. I hope it was reasonably enjoyable. I didn't talk about Tekken or video games at all in this one, and I think that might be the way I'm going to keep it going forward. A sort of new rule that I decided I'm going to keep is that I don't really want to talk a lot about other people in the real world, you know, people you might know, like other video game players or content creators, because I don't know, that just seems to be a slippery slope, and I'm very allergic to stuff like drama. So I'm going to try and keep this quite personal, and it's going to be something similar to this going forward, and I hope that's okay. I hope you liked it. Thank you so much for being here for this one, and I will see you guys again very soon. Bye bye for now.